It was an early Monday morning in Providence, Rhode Island, and the courthouse was already buzzing with people clutching envelopes, forms, and tickets. But among the adults waiting nervously in line sat a young girl who looked completely out of place. Her name was Emily Carter, and she was only 14 years old. She sat quietly, clutching a crumpled parking ticket in her trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the floor. Emily wasn't supposed to be there. Most of the people who stood before Judge Frank Caprio were adults, workers, parents, sometimes college students. But a child? That was something unusual. Even the clerk at the desk had raised an eyebrow when she first walked in. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" he'd asked gently. "No, sir," she'd replied softly. "I'm here for my mom's car. I got a ticket." When her case was called, Judge Caprio glanced at the paper, then looked up in surprise. "Emily Carter?" he said, his familiar warm voice filling the courtroom. "You're only 14 years old?" Emily nodded nervously, walking up to the stand. Her voice trembled as she began to explain. "Yes, sir. I didn't mean to park wrong. I was just waiting for my mom." The courtroom grew quiet. The officers, clerks, and even the people in line behind her turned to listen. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his eyes soft with curiosity. "Tell me what happened," he said kindly. Emily took a deep breath. "My mom works 2 jobs. She was in the hospital that morning because she's a nurse. She asked me to wait in the car while she ran in to check on a patient. It was supposed to be just 5 minutes, but she got called for an emergency. I didn't want to leave. The car was parked in a no-parking zone, and when I came back there was a ticket." The courtroom murmured quietly. The officer who had issued the ticket, sitting in the back, shifted uncomfortably. He remembered that morning, the little red car by the curb and the small figure in the driver's seat. He hadn't realized she was just a child. Judge Caprio listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "So you were waiting for your mother because she was helping someone in an emergency?" Emily nodded. "Yes, sir. She's all I have. My dad passed away when I was little. Sometimes I go with her to work so she's not alone driving home late." Her words hit the judge like a wave. He had heard thousands of cases, excuses, stories, explanations. But this one was different. There was no attitude in her voice, no attempt to dodge responsibility. Just honesty, humility, and a child's quiet strength. He smiled gently. "Emily, you know what I like about your story," he said. "You're loyal. You stayed to make sure your mother was safe. That says a lot about your heart." Emily's cheeks flushed. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. He turned to the courtroom camera, knowing millions watched his cases online. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "sometimes we forget that behind every ticket there's a story. And today, this story is about a young girl who reminds us of love and responsibility, things no fine can measure." He looked back at Emily. "Do you have the ticket with you?" She handed it over. The judge examined it, then smiled softly. "Well, Emily, technically you're guilty, but the court also has something more powerful than punishment. It has mercy." He paused. "How's your mother doing now?" Emily's eyes glistened. "She's tired, sir. She works double shifts." "But she's okay," Judge Caprio nodded. "You tell your mother she raised a good daughter. And as for this ticket," he picked up his gavel with a small grin, "I think it deserves a special ruling." The courtroom waited in silence as he leaned forward. "Case dismissed." Applause broke out, but Emily didn't move. Tears filled her eyes, not because of the ticket, but because someone had finally noticed her struggle. Judge Caprio smiled kindly. "Emily, come here a moment." She approached shyly. He reached into his desk drawer and handed her a small envelope. "Inside," he said softly, "is something for your mom. Tell her to have breakfast on me after her next shift." She nodded, whispering, "Thank you, Judge Caprio." As she left the courtroom, Judge Caprio sat back, his heart heavy. Something about that girl stayed with him. Her calmness, her story, her eyes. He didn't know it yet, but that small act of compassion was about to uncover a truth that would change everything. When Emily left the courtroom, she held the small white envelope like it was made of glass. Her heart still raced from the moment she had stood before Judge Caprio, his voice kind, his words warm, and his compassion real. She had never met anyone in authority who spoke so gently, especially to someone like her, a kid who'd spent most of her life trying to stay invisible. Outside, the late morning sun reflected off the courthouse steps. Emily sat on the edge of the stairs, tore open the envelope, and found a $50 bill inside with a small note written in neat handwriting, "For breakfast. Keep being kind." Judge Frank Caprio. She smiled faintly. It wasn't about the money, it was the kindness. She hadn't seen that in a long time. Her mother, Nurse Linda Carter, worked endless hours just to keep their tiny apartment running. Since Emily's father had died in a construction accident 3 years ago, their lives had been a cycle of bills, grief, and survival. That night, when her mother came home from her second shift, Emily waited with the note. Linda looked exhausted. Her scrub still smelled faintly of disinfectant, her hands trembling from hours of work. Emily handed her the envelope. "Judge Caprio gave this to you," she said quietly. Linda froze. "Judge Caprio?" she repeated, confused. Emily nodded. "He said it's for breakfast. He dismissed the ticket." Tears filled Linda's eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, sitting down and pulling Emily into her arms. "That man has the kindest heart. But you shouldn't have had to go there alone." "I wanted to help," Emily said, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. "You were working so hard." Linda exhaled shakily, staring at the note. "He didn't just dismiss a ticket. He reminded me that there's still goodness in the world." The next morning, the two went to a small diner near the hospital. They ordered pancakes and orange juice, a luxury they hadn't afforded in months. For the first time in a long while, Emily saw her mother smile without worry. But as they sat there, something unexpected happened. A man at the counter, dressed in a dark suit, kept glancing their way. Finally, he approached. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Are you Linda Carter?" Linda stiffened. "Yes. Who's asking?" The man smiled and extended his hand. "My name is Robert Flynn. I work for Judge Frank Caprio's Community Outreach Foundation. The judge asked me to check in on you and your daughter." Linda blinked in surprise. What?" Robert nodded. "He was moved by your daughter's story. He said something didn't sit right with him. A 14-year-old handling a court ticket alone? He wanted to make sure you're both okay." Linda's face flushed with emotion. "We're managing," she said softly. "It's just been hard since my husband passed, but we're getting by." Robert's expression softened. "I understand. The judge believes in helping families like yours. If you don't mind, we'd like to visit your home. No strings attached." Linda hesitated but finally agreed. That evening, Robert and a social worker came by their small apartment. It was clean but clearly worn down, peeling paint, a flickering light, and a kitchen table that leaned slightly to one side. Robert looked around quietly, then turned to Linda. "You've been doing everything you can," he said sincerely. "Judge Caprio's foundation offers emergency aid, food, repairs, even education support. Would you allow us to help?" Linda bit her lip, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "Just say yes," Robert replied with a smile. That night, after they left, Emily sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker. For the first time since her father's death, she felt something new stirring inside her. Hope. But across town, Judge Caprio sat at his desk, staring at a file Robert had brought back. There was something in it that stopped him cold. Emily's last name, Carter, matched one in an old case file. "Carter," he murmured, opening the document. It was from years ago, a wrongful death lawsuit involving a construction company, a worker who'd fallen due to negligence, and a man named Thomas Carter, Emily's father. Judge Caprio leaned back, his heart sinking. He remembered that case. The company had won on a technicality. The family never received justice. And now, sitting in his courtroom years later, was that man's daughter. The judge closed the file slowly, realization dawning. "This isn't just coincidence," he whispered. "This is fate." He knew in that moment that dismissing the ticket wasn't enough. He had to set things right, not just for Emily, but for the father she lost. The next morning, Judge Frank Caprio sat alone in his chambers, the morning sunlight streaming through the blinds and illuminating the thick folder in front of him. The name on the tab read, "Thomas Carter versus Atlas Construction Company." He remembered the case well. It had been one of those files that kept him awake at night. A hard-working man had fallen to his death because a safety railing had not been secured properly. The company's lawyers had found a loophole, claiming employee negligence, and the court had ruled in their favor. The widow, Linda Carter, had left the courtroom that day in tears. And now, her daughter, that same little girl who had been waiting in the car, had stood before him years later. Life had come full circle in a way that felt too deliberate to ignore. Judge Caprio tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking. There was nothing he hated more than injustice hidden behind legal paperwork. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Robert," he said when his aide answered, "get me everything we have on Atlas Construction. I don't care how old it is. I want to know if they're still operating." Robert hesitated. "Sir, are you thinking of reopening the Carter case?" "I'm thinking," Caprio replied, "of doing what should have been done years ago." Meanwhile, across town, Linda was cleaning the small apartment while Emily worked on her homework. Things had started to feel lighter since their meeting with Robert. The foundation had offered to cover some of their overdue rent and groceries. For the first time in months, the kitchen had fresh fruit on the counter. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, Linda opened it to find Robert again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Judge Caprio himself. "Your Honor," Linda gasped, nearly dropping the dish towel in her hand. He smiled warmly. "Please, call me Frank." He stepped inside, his kind eyes scanning the humble home. "You have a lovely place. I can see you've worked hard to make it a home." Linda blushed slightly, embarrassed by the peeling wallpaper. "It's not much, but we do our best." Caprio nodded, then gestured toward the table. "May we sit for a moment? I wanted to talk to you about something important." Once they were seated, Caprio opened his briefcase and placed the old file on the table. "Linda," he began carefully, "I recently realized something. I presided over your husband's case years ago." Her eyes widened. You did?" He nodded solemnly. "Thomas Carter, a good man, a father, a husband, a worker trying to provide. I remember that verdict, and I remember feeling that justice wasn't served. It's haunted me for years." Linda's hands trembled. "That case destroyed us. I had no money for appeals. They made it sound like it was his fault, but he was careful. He was always careful." Caprio's voice softened. "I believe you. I always did. But back then, the evidence we needed wasn't available. Things are different now." He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a report. Atlas Construction was audited last year. Turns out, they falsified safety reports for over a decade, including during your husband's accident. The new evidence changes everything." Linda gasped, her hand covering her mouth. "You mean?" Caprio nodded. "If we file to reopen the case, your husband's name could be cleared, and you and Emily could finally receive the compensation that was denied to you." Tears streamed down Linda's face as she whispered, "I thought that door was closed forever." "Sometimes," Caprio said with a gentle smile, "the law closes a door, but justice finds another way in." Emily, who had been standing quietly by the doorway, stepped forward. "Judge Caprio, thank you." He smiled warmly at her. "You don't need to thank me, Emily. You reminded me why I do this, why fairness matters." That night, after they left, Linda sat at the table long after Emily went to bed. She touched her husband's old photograph and whispered, "They might finally know the truth, Tom." Across town, Caprio returned to his office. He knew reopening the case wouldn't be easy. Atlas Construction had money, lawyers, and power, but he also knew something they didn't. He had the truth now. And for the first time in years, Judge Caprio felt something deep inside him ignite again, the fire of justice that had made him choose this life in the first place. He looked at the old file one last time before turning off the light. "We'll get them this time," he murmured. "For Thomas, for Linda, for Emily." 3 months later, the courthouse in Providence was filled once again. But this time, it wasn't for a traffic ticket. It was for something much bigger. The case that once slipped quietly into the archives had returned with force. Linda Carter versus Atlas Construction Company. The press had caught wind of it. Reporters whispered about the connection. A grieving widow, a 14-year-old girl, and the beloved judge, Frank Caprio himself, bringing an old injustice back into the light. Cameras were rolling, and every seat in the courtroom was taken. Emily sat beside her mother, her hands tightly clasped. She wore a simple dress and her father's old silver watch, the one piece of him she still had. Linda looked nervous but determined. Years of pain, silence, and hard work had brought her to this moment. Judge Caprio entered the courtroom, his expression calm but resolute. He took his seat and glanced at the familiar faces before him. The defense lawyers from Atlas Construction looked smug, dressed in tailored suits and surrounded by boxes of paperwork. But the judge had something stronger, the truth and the courage of a family who never gave up. "Good morning," Caprio began, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "This is a hearing to review new evidence in the matter of the late Thomas Carter. This court intends to determine whether justice was denied years ago, and if so, to make it right." The defense attorney stood smirking. Your Honor, with all due respect, this case was settled long ago. We see no grounds to reopen it. Caprio looked at him evenly. Counselor, the law allows for exceptions when new evidence is found, especially evidence that proves fraud. He turned to Robert Flynn, who stood ready with a binder. Mr. Flynn, please present Exhibit A. Robert stepped forward and displayed several inspection reports dated around the time of Thomas Carter's accident. These, he said, were recently recovered during a state audit. They prove Atlas Construction falsified safety reports to pass regulatory checks. One of these forged reports is from the very day Mr. Carter fell. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney scrambled through his papers. Your Honor, these documents are signed, Robert interrupted firmly, by your client's safety director, who later admitted under oath that they never performed the inspection. Judge Caprio's voice grew firmer. Atlas Construction built an empire on deceit, and an innocent man paid the price for their greed. He paused, looking toward Linda. Mrs. Carter, would you like to say something before I deliver my decision? Linda stood slowly, her voice trembling but clear. For years I told my daughter her father was a good man. I told her he died trying to do his job. People didn't believe me. We were left with nothing, no justice, no apology, but today I just want his name cleared. That's all I've ever wanted. Emily wiped her tears as her mother sat back down. Judge Caprio nodded gently, then turned to the courtroom. When I first saw young Emily Carter here months ago, she was just a child with a parking ticket. But that ticket brought us back to this, to the truth. This family has lived with injustice long enough. He lifted the gavel slowly. This court hereby rules that Thomas Carter's death was not due to negligence on his part, but to the gross misconduct and fraudulent actions of Atlas Construction. The original verdict is vacated. A sob escaped from Linda's lips. As Caprio continued, the company is ordered to issue a full public apology, pay restitution, and fund a memorial scholarship in Thomas Carter's name for the children of construction workers who've lost their lives on the job. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Case closed. Applause erupted through the courtroom. Reporters rushed forward, capturing the moment that would soon go viral across the country. Judge Caprio's courtroom once again turning heartbreak into hope. After the hearing, Judge Caprio approached Emily and her mother. Your father's name will be remembered with honor, he said softly. And Emily, you reminded me what true justice looks like, not in books or laws, but in the courage to stand up when no one else will. Emily smiled through tears. You believed in us, sir. Thank you. As they left the courthouse together, sunlight spilled across the steps, the same steps Emily had sat on the day of her ticket. But this time she didn't feel small or afraid. She felt proud. Her father's name had been cleared, her mother's tears had turned to joy, and the man who once dismissed a parking ticket had given them back their dignity. That evening, Judge Caprio sat in his chambers alone. On his desk lay the old case file, now stamped reopened, justice served. He smiled, whispering to himself, sometimes the smallest case leads to the biggest truth, and somewhere in Providence, a 14-year-old girl looked up at the stars, clutching her father's watch, and whispered, We did it, Dad.